All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's study. I started a topic a couple of weeks back when we started Hanukkah. We were approaching Hanukkah. I talked about the conflict of darkness of light, and I figured I will continue this theme with you a little bit longer. Why? Because this actually is a very broad topic, right? I talked about how darkness and light, it doesn't just exist in a Hanukkah story, it exists in our lives. And Hanukkah story is way, way more than just the story of the struggle and the miracles and all these things. It is really about conflict that we humans experience, conflict within us, that we have to choose the path of light, but the darkness is always around and about. And we can make a wrong choice, and we can take a wrong turn, and we can go in a completely wrong direction. Even if we began maybe in a good way, we can end in a really bad way. And hopefully we can reverse and change it back, right? But unfortunately, that is the reality of human history. Sometimes we start really well and we take the wrong turn. So perhaps you remember how I talked about the Maccabees and how the revolution that they started was really a well-started revolution. What they wanted to fight for was freedom of worship, right? Ability to be who they are, ability to be Jews and worship their God in their own land and not be forced by foreign oppressors to adopt ways that are not their own and start embracing customs and traditions that are not their own. They just wanted to be who they are and they wanted to worship, right? And that is a very good aspiration. And that's what they fought for. But remember, as I went through the history of the Maccabees, I told you how as they won, as their victories grew, their agenda, or what they fought for, started to change and transform. It became less about freedom of faith and religion and practice, and it became more about getting extra territory. It became more about creating buffer zones, about pushing back those pagans and those people who oppress us all the time. It became about territorial dominance, of creating security zones, essentially, right? But not just that. Then it turned into going and crossing into other countries and taking them over. And I talked to you about some of the tragic things that Maccabees did, and particularly John Hyrcanus. Remember, he went out and he forcefully converted Idumeans, right? He went all the way to Nabatea. He went to Jordan, which Israelites have not lived there since the days of Joshua, okay? He went all the way over there, and he says, okay, this is our land, we conquered it, and you have to be Jews. Everyone has to be circumcised. Now, you're going to have to be a part of our kingdom, and this is the only way we can ensure your loyalty, is you have to adopt our ways, you have to adopt our religion. You want to live in this land, this is our land now, become Jews, this is it. So that became the path for the Idumeans, but it was a forced path. So you can imagine how much a person is going to be a true adherent to religion if they were forced upon that path. And then there was other populations, like in the Galilee, there were some people who lived who were not Jewish, whom the Maccabean kings decided to convert. Again, Hyrcanus, he destroyed the Samaritan temple. Samaritans have been there for a long time. And yes, they should not have had the temple there, but the temple's been there since the days of Persians. And remember, Jews were building the temple in Jerusalem when they came back from Babylon, and Samaritans said, well, we have to have our temple to kind of compete with Jerusalem. They weren't exactly on the same page of going to Jerusalem to worship. So these two competing temples, so Samaritan temple was not a big deal. It was not a huge community. They were not a threat, yet the Maccabee kings felt that they needed to be subjugated. They needed to be brought into Israel proper. And so they did the same thing. They practiced forced conversions, which at that time was a very political action, what I want you to realize. But this is when state and religion are fused together. Remember, you may be thinking about separation of these things, but they weren't thinking about it that way. And of course, for the Maccabees, the problem was what? That they were kings, or ruling as kings, but they were also priests. So they actually combined within themselves two powers. the religious power and the political power. And that's why they acted the way they acted. That's why they did what they did. They didn't see separation because for them, that separation didn't exist, personally. So they governed the way they governed. So we've been talking about this conflict of darkness and light. We've been talking about what happened to the Maccabees, how they started off really well and how they just went in a terrible direction. How they became power hungry, how everybody fought everybody. A brother fought against brother. Maccabee brothers, essentially, as the second and third generation went on, they just fought against each other, trying to usurp each other and trying to take over the power. Why? Because there could only be one high priest. And if that high priest happens to be also king, then there can be only one guy at the top. And that's what they fought for all the time. So we also talked about Alexander Jannaeus, which I know I shocked some of you. Alexander Yanai, he was one of these very brutal Maccabean kings. I probably shocked you last time by telling you about how he crucified all those Pharisees, right? And made them watch how their own wives and children were slaughtered right in front of them. I mean, this is, like I said, crucifixions is something that happened way before Jesus, way before the Gospels. This is something that Romans did, and Alexander Jannaeus was that kind of a Maccabean king. He was a Hasmonean who was brutal, just absolutely brutal to his enemies. And so Pharisees didn't like him. They spoke up against him. They started a civil war. I told you this whole story about how he got insulted, and he started a civil war in Israel. And yes, people were crucified as rebels against the state. That's what Romans did. Romans, by the way, did not crucify criminals. They didn't crucify thieves or pickpockets. You know who they crucified? Political dissidents. People who went against Rome politically. That's who they crucified. Because the rebels, the people who challenged the power of Rome, that's whom they crucified. So that's what crucifixions were reserved for revolutionaries. And if you want to understand what happened to Yeshua, you have to see him in that light, because he was seen as somebody who was a revolutionary, who was, some people claim, to be a king, right? Romans didn't like that very much. Can't be a king. Can't, now, not when we're in charge. No, that's not how it's going to work. So this is the conflict of darkness and light. So remember I told you, I'm just taking you back just a little bit. In the 1st century BCE, we have Alexander Jannaeus, who fought with the Pharisees, and likely he wiped out most of them, by the way. I mean, this was a civil war that went on for a while. The few influential leaders of the Pharisaic movement who were left, they were all imprisoned. And his wife, Salome, I told you about her last time, she freed them, and she leaned heavily on their counsel as basically they ruled peacefully for a decade together. Salome was the queen, and the Pharisees made all the rules and the laws. She kind of leaned on them for the government. That was a very interesting partnership, completely not like her husband. And so they had an era of peace. But then the Pharisees who survived, they likely learned some new lessons about aligning with royal power, because as we look at the Pharisees later on, they don't seem to cooperate very well with the royals. When Salome died, a civil war ignited. Who fought that civil war? Her sons. That's who fought. Salome had 2 sons. Now this is 1st century BC. Remember, we're talking about the latter part, the middle of 1st century BC. She had 2 sons. Hyrcanus II was the older son. He followed the Pharisee traditions. He was perceived by Josephus as a weaker person. Perhaps it was his personality, just how he was, not as decisive and so on and so forth. So his younger brother, Aristobulus, however, Aristobulus II, he was aggressive, and he was very strongly supported by the temple aristocracy. Aristobulus was bent on taking over power from his brother by force. Remember, Hyrcanus was installed as the priest. Salome was the queen. Salome dies, and now, by default, Hyrcanus is going to assume that Maccabean role again, right? Except the civil war breaks out. And so their struggle was not merely about personal ambitions. It's not about just they wanted to be king. But basically, it represented competing visions for authority in Israel. Because what you have is now you have an entire factions within an Israeli high society, within aristocracy fighting. One faction aligns itself with this group and another aligns itself with this group. Now there's a little bit of a polarity that exists in religious movements in the first century BC. So Josephus writes to us in his Polemos, in War, the Pharisees were for Hyrcanus, but the Sadducees joined with Aristobulus. See, two different brothers, two brothers from the same family, two factions backed them. And that was the Civil War. So here Pharisees are again caught in the middle of a civil war, something they didn't really want to be caught into, because they are learning lessons about violence at this point. But at this point, they're still in the midst of it. Now, the Sadducees, if you don't know, they originated largely from the priestly and aristocratic families. They aligned themselves with kingship, with sacrificial authority, and political control of Jerusalem. That's really what they cared about. That was their entire agenda. The Pharisees were influential among the populace, the common people. They emphasized Torah. They emphasized its careful and precise interpretation. They emphasized purity in everyday life. They emphasized ancestral laws and restraint of royal power. They did not trust kings, particularly they just did not trust the Maccabean kings because of what history has taught them. Yes, ma'am?
Did the Sadducees originate from the original Aaronic priestly line or from the corrupt ones?
So Sadducees, actually their name comes from Tzadok. You know, if you think of it, that you hear that Sadducee is a Greek way of pronouncing it. In Hebrew, they're called Tzadukim. So it comes from Tzadok, who's a priest. So they're actually hereditary priests of that particular priestly line, which has been there since the days of David. When David established the priestly orders, the high priest always came from the family of Tzadok. Okay, and all the other priestly families, they're right there in Kings and Chronicles. We can read about them. There was a rotation in which they all served. But what happened with Maccabees, they displaced that. Because Hasmonean family is not supposed to be the high priestly family. But because they had the sword and they had the support of the people, they displaced the Tzedukim, essentially, who were the original descendants of Tzadok, and pushed them aside. And they were no longer priests. So as a result, a whole dissension appeared, and if you heard about these scenes, okay, people who left Jerusalem altogether, they just said, we can't be involved in this temple because everything is off, everything is wrong. That's what they did. They protested and they left. So they also are from the line of Tzadok. These scenes were led by the same, essentially, family group from which the priests came. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? You guys know you can jump in. Because I'm on the roll, I'm just walking you through a little bit of a history, but you can jump in and just ask questions as we go along. So we have this formation of Sadducees and Pharisees already happening in the first century BC. But remember, Pharisees have been around for a little while longer. We'll go back and I'll teach more about their origins. But they have changed a lot. Everything, this mess that happens actually changes the Pharisaic movement. They become something that they weren't before because of the events of those days. They transformed them. So Aristobulus, he seized Jerusalem by force from his brother, and Hyrcanus had to flee for his life. That's what happened. And his trusted court advisor, Antipater, the son of Antipas, suggested that he should seek foreign backing for the war. If you are losing in the war, you look for allies. So he says, look for some outsiders to help defeat your brother. First, Antipater suggested an Idumean king might help. Why? Antipater himself was from Idumea. He was a second generation convert at this point. So Antipas, his father, was converted, forcefully circumcised by John Hyrcanus. Antipater comes into that. And so he says, hey, let's go to the Idumeans. They'll help. They're my relatives. And then they said, no, Idumeans are not that much help. Let's turn to Romans. And they go to see Pompey, while he was in Damascus. At that point, Pompey has his own campaigns as he's trying to conquer the world for Rome, right? For Rome, for glory, for all these things. So, and of course they go, hey, can you help us out, straighten out our neighborhood? And what happens is Josephus records that when Pompey received envoys in Damascus, there were 3 delegations that appeared before him. 3, not 2. You would have thought there would have been two brothers fighting. No, there were 3. There was Aristobulus, there was Hyrcanus, and the third group. There was also a third group. This is what he says. And there came also a deputation of the Jews who desired to be rid of the kings altogether, to live according to the laws of their forefathers. So my guess, I don't know, Josephus doesn't say this in a straightforward way, but my guess that this third party were certainly the representatives of the Pharisaic movement. They said, we're sick and tired of this guy, and we're sick and tired of this guy. In fact, we don't want any kings. This whole entire family is nothing but trouble. They sought neither brother. What they wanted is to abolish the Hasmonean monarchy itself altogether. Kingship, once at some point it was seen as divinely sanctioned, and perhaps under the Maccabees when things got started it was good, but it becomes synonymous with unending bloodshed and corruption. Because at this point, the wars were unending. And the rivalry within the family, brother going after brother, is unending. And remember, why does the sages say the temple was destroyed? Because of the infighting among the Jews. Brother going against brother, family on family. So the Pharisees, they had a right idea. They said, these guys are taking us in a very bad direction. We just need to get rid of them and live how we should live, the way the Torah tells us to live, with God being our king. Are these not the ideals that we read in the scrolls? That's exactly what we read. So they said, let's rid of them. That's what we read in Josephus, at least. So Pompey hears out 3 proposals, essentially. So you can figure out who he's going to take up. But at least it's interesting that there were 3 parties or 3 opinions. Like 2 Jews, 3 opinions. There were more than 2 Jews there, but at least we had 3 opinions. So Aristobulus, he was pretty feisty. He resisted Rome. Remember, he captured Jerusalem from his brother. So he is entrenched in Jerusalem. And in 63 BCE, sorry, I made a mistake there on a slide, Pompey took Jerusalem by force. Pompey comes and invades Jerusalem. 12,000 Jews died in that battle, defending Jerusalem. He takes the temple. General Pompey entered the Holy of Holies, we're told, yet he did not plunder the temple. That's an amazing thing. So with all the gold and all the things that he could have stolen, he didn't. He had respect for the religion of the Jews. He didn't want to take this upon himself. So he didn't plunder it. He did favor Hyrcanus, not because he liked him better, but because he posed no threat to the Roman authority. He was kind of an easygoing guy, not really feisty, didn't really have much fight in him. So he's like, you know what? Not a bad ruler. So Josephus writes to us, thus did the government of the Hasmoneans cease, after it had lasted for 126 years. So there was a very short period of Jewish independence, 126 years, when the Ptolemies did not rule, and the Seleucids did not rule Israel. 126 years. But in that 126 years, how many kings rose and fell, and how many of them fought against each other and killed each other? This may have been an independent moment, but it was certainly a very turbulent one, and more trouble than it was worth, essentially. So Hyrcanus II was installed as the high priest. He's back in power now. But he was stripped of his royal administrative authority. He doesn't really get to run anything except the temple. Judea lost its independence, and the Hasmonean kingdom has come to an end. And that begins the reign of Rome over Israel. That's how the independence was lost. Now imagine what would have happened if people didn't fight each other. They could have had that independence. And they might have even had united front if the Romans came. And if the Romans came and they saw these people and they were too strong, they're like, well, we'll just go conquer somebody else and leave these people alone. And who knows for how many more years independence might have been. Eventually, they would have needed that route to go to Egypt. Because remember, Julius Caesar, he wanted to really conquer Egypt. Anyway, the Romans always wanted Egypt. So eventually, Israel would have been on the path and they would have gotten conquered. But maybe they would have had a few more years of peace. Maybe there would have been more stability. Maybe a fewer people would have died. But all these wars essentially wreaked havoc on Israel. And it really demoralized people in many ways. So you can imagine what the population was feeling, what people were feeling, what the state of their spiritual condition was also at that time. So there you go. We move to Hyrcanus now. So from this point forward, Jewish leadership was fractured along three areas. We had the political control of the capital, okay, the temple administration, and the Torah-based local communal governance. So you could see the polarization that has already started before now is going to fall into the places that you may find more familiarity with. The Sadducees, they used the temple rituals to maintain their aristocratic privilege and influence working under Roman rule. They could stay aristocrats, they could stay rich, they could stay part of that system that kept them going, essentially. And so that's what they did. The Pharisees, they had no real political power, but they wielded profound moral influence over everyday religious life. They found a way to be relevant. They taught in the synagogues. They shaped practical observance of the commandments and transmitted oral traditions. They were with the people, with the masses in the synagogues, and that gave them a moral voice, a voice of authority in a society where they didn't really have true power. Because the true power and the true money really was in the temple. So you have this polarization. You can see how Pharisees and Sadducees will now be two different camps pursuing two different trajectories in Jewish society. And the whole capital administration, the political administration of the capital, of course, that fell to Romans. You understand? They wouldn't let anybody have it just yet. So back to Antipater. Antipater, and I've brought him up before for you, he's an important person in the story. He was a trusted advisor of Hyrcanus II. And because of his priestly duties, obviously Hyrcanus II had to manage the temple, Antipater managed many practical affairs in Jerusalem under the governors that Pompey set up. So Antipater was a friend of Hyrcanus, an advisor that kind of slowly moved into this managerial role of things that didn't involve the temple, which you realize is really the political structure of Jerusalem. And so slowly he kind of worked himself into power. Very gradually, but he did. Now, what happened next, and I'm skipping a little bit of the history over there, kind of fast forwarding you. What happened next is really pivotal, and this is where you realize that history just unravels the way it's meant to unravel. Julius Caesar, he advanced his forces against Alexandria in 48 BCE. So remember, this is the war. Caesar wants to conquer Egypt, okay? So he moves his forces. Of course, he has to go through Jerusalem. And at that point, you know, Judea, Jerusalem is already their territory. They're already paying taxes, they're paying tribute. And so they're going through, they're resupplying. At this point, Antipater proved himself very useful to the Romans. He basically supplied them with what they needed. He gave them all the things that they needed. He sent men. He fought on their side. I mean, he got into the middle of the battle and fought with Julius Caesar, making sure that he wins. He put his entire force behind him. So because he was so useful to the Romans, so supportive of them, according to Josephus, Caesar granted Antipater Roman citizenship. And, more importantly, he gave him real power. It says in Antiquities, Caesar made Antipater procurator of Judea. He officially made him a governor, an appointee. Now, every time the emperor changed, the procurator changed. Procurators could be recalled. It's kind of an administrative position. So, and there's some kickbacks, by the way, too. If you realize there's some serious kickbacks. So Antipater became the procurator of Judea, and in turn, he quickly appointed his sons, Phasael, as the governor of Jerusalem, and young Herod as the governor of Galilee. So, and here we got to Herod. At this point, Herod is a very young man, and he gets to govern Galilee as his region. That is how his career starts. Actually, his career is about to get supercharged. Because what happens next, Antipater didn't last long. So this was in 48 BCE, okay? And his sons are now in power. He's kind of, all right, I'm going to govern all of Israel. My sons will have Jerusalem and Galilee. He's setting himself up. You see, Antipater was a good choice for Romans because he was not a Hasmonean. He was not a priest. He was capable executive, but he was well outside of the traditional priest-king power structure in Judea. He was an outsider. So Romans kind of sort of trusted him more because he was an insider, but he was an outsider. He wasn't from any of the noble families, yet he knew how Jews worked, and he's been a convert in Judaism. So he understood the system from the inside, and there was a sudden shift in power. Nobody expected for this to happen. And it generated some serious resentment among the Hasmonean loyalists, among the aristocratic priestly families, and all sorts of nationalist groups, because people didn't want a foreigner, an outsider, he's insider and an outsider. Herod and Antipater, they're these polarizing figures. So in 43 BCE, Antipater was poisoned. And he was poisoned by a nobleman. Josephus writes this. He says, Malichus corrupted one of Antipater's servants to poison him. So they conspired to kill him off. And after Antipater's assassination, of course, his son Herod inherited the Roman backing and favor. And that's how Herod really became the powerhouse, because Antipater died and basically handed his influence and his connections to everything in Rome to him. Herod has already proven himself because he's already governed Galilee for quite a while. And so what's with expanding territory? How difficult would that be? At that point, Herod is already rubbing shoulders with all the important Romans. He's already going off to Rome. He's going to take his education in Rome, and so on and so forth. So his career is really supercharged and launched by the fact that his father is assassinating. So that's how Herod comes onto the scene. So I told you, Antipater, he's a pretty important figure, and if you don't understand him, then you don't realize how Herod worked his way in to being in charge in Israel. So Herod, through calculated brutality and intrigues of all sorts of political loyalty and alliances, Herod slowly eliminated the remaining Hasmoneans, including all of Aristobulus' descendants. He had a genius plan. Herod even married into the Hasmonean family. He married Princess Mariamne, only to extinguish the dynasty from the inside. He married, and then he killed them off one by one. And nobody said anything because, hey, they're his family, Yet we know that Herod was quite brutal to his family. He killed off his own offspring, it says. Romans had a very funny saying. They said it's better be a pig in Herod's house than a son. Because at least the pig is safe. And I'm serious. And in Greek, it actually sounds really funny, because in Greek, word huios is son, and hus is pig. So you got a play of words, like it's better be a hus than a huios. You better be a pig than a son. And it's an anecdotal saying. I don't quite know where it comes from, but we get it from Roman history, like Roman writers like Macrobius, and they write about it, and they're saying this is what Herod was known for. He was known for his brutality, for literally eliminating his own family members under suspicion. If he was suspicious of you, you're gone. Son, no son, it doesn't matter. Relative, you might be gunning after my power, you're gone. If I feel like you have ambitions for what I have, you're gone. So Josephus wrote that he destroyed the whole family of the Hasmoneans and left none remaining. Now, why would he do that? To make sure that nobody would ever crawl out from anywhere saying I'm some long descendant of the Hasmonean line to claim the throne. Because that was the last of the kings and the last of the priests, essentially. Because at this point, all the priests are appointed by the Romans. There are no actual real priesthood anymore that is hereditary from the proper line. At this point, every priesthood is bought for money, appointed by the Romans. They give a huge bribe to the Romans, and the Romans install them as the priests. And this is how it has been since the days of the Seleucids. Remember when I told you when the first priest, when Jason bribed, Antiochus, way back in the time of the Maccabean Wars, that was the first step of the foreign kings setting up, calling who the priests would be. Once that got going, it actually never stopped. So all the priests that we read about, they were not really legitimate priests who should have been there. They were people of money and influence and power who made their way into those positions. So Herod, as I said, it was a polarizing figure. He's definitely brutal. He had his positive sides too. Nothing is just, even the broken clock is right occasionally, right? So he had some good things. In 37 BC, Herod was confirmed as the king of the Jews. That's what he was called. Basileus, he was called king. The coins came out. And on the coins, it literally said, King of the Jews. He was called. That's what he was called in Greek. And Roman Senate awarded him that title. He was pretty tight with the Romans there. And so his reign marked a new era for Israel. It was unprecedented building projects, including massive renovations to the temple, but also widespread fear and many, many, many executions. He was brilliant in many ways, but he was brutal in just as many ways, if not more. I mean, you realize that building the temple is one thing. If you've been to Israel, Caesarea, that's his work too. Tiberias, that's his work too. Like this, most of the ancient city of Tiberias, which is still being excavated even today. Certain portions of it are still under earth, so still being a magnificent place. Sebastia, like in the place of where the right next to where Samaritans had their temple, Herod built a huge pagan temple, and of course. He's built lots of different things all throughout the land of Israel. Temple in Jerusalem is only but one of a very massive construction projects, but he had some other construction projects that were also quite impressive. It's just this one is the one he's really, really known for. But there's some other ones. So perhaps, when we go to Israel, I'll show you some of the Herod's construction. It's pretty cool. He was brilliant in many ways. Now, what happened in this era, what happened in this time, the Pharisees, they were in the midst of all this, and they navigated Herod's reign very carefully. They actually chose to withdraw from politics altogether, or at least that's what I gather. That's what all the historical records tend to point. Nobody comes out and says it, but by early 1st century of the Common Era, Judea pretty much was firmly ruled by Roman prefects, and you had the king, who was Herod. And of course then his descendants. And the Sadducees, they controlled the temple ritual. And the Pharisees shaped the popular communal life in the synagogues. And Rome just held the sword and collected taxes. And that's how it was. That was the status quo of the 1st century. So when we read the Gospels, that is the atmosphere into which we jump into. But you have to understand what came before. Which is why I'm telling you this history. I'm explaining you the history of the Maccabees and all of the dynasties and all the mess that has transpired of how we get, when we read the Gospels, hopefully what I'm sharing with you will now inform you as you read those words. And maybe you even might reinterpret some of these words. So, Pharisees were basically conspicuously absent from much of the political intrigue of this era. We just don't see them. Which suggesting to me that they deliberately retreated from all the power struggles. They just didn't want to be a part of it. Later rabbinic memory preserves such a posture this way. This is from Mishnah, from Pirkei Avot. Many of you know this document. The rabbis say, Pray for the welfare of the kingdom, for without fear of it, people would swallow one another alive. So the rabbis say, pray for the welfare of the kingdom. Just don't meddle with it. Don't get into the middle of it, but just pray. We need the kingdom. We need this authority because we need order. But it's a messy one. The Pharisees must have surmised the governments are transient. But Torah endures. Power of the throne corrupts. Very often, that's what it does. Think of how many kings we have in the biblical history that are good, and think of how many kings we have that are bad. Power of the throne corrupts. And Jewish survival as a people, faithful to God, depended on adaptation, not domination. In the time when you have the most powerful and strongest military to rule the world yet. Romans were the biggest and the most powerful military since Alexander. They were a force to reckon with, and at that time, the Pharisees made a bet. We have to adapt. We can't dominate. We can't take over. We can't revolt. We cannot liberate ourselves. We have to adapt how to live with this new reality. And they found a way. They found a way. That was their path. And in fact, what we read in the Gospels, what we read in the stories, and later on, is very much due to this realization that true adaptation was needed in this era. So Herod the Great viewed Pharisees with suspicion, but he tolerated them. Why he tolerated them was because if they avoided sedition against him, he just kind of let them be. Josephus records this: the Pharisees were not willing to take an oath of fidelity to him. He wanted their loyalty. He wanted them to swear allegiance to him, and they wouldn't. And guess what? He didn't kill them. He tolerated them. Remarkably, Herod, he punished anyone that he was suspicious of, but left the Pharisees alone, recognizing their moral authority and the danger of antagonizing the masses who saw them as their teachers. You're going to kill my teacher? It's going to be a little bit of a problem. So the Pharisees expressed their moral dissent without outright rebellion. They said, no, we're not pledging allegiance to you. We're not pledging loyalty to you. But we're also not going to start a revolution and try to overthrow you. So they refused to cooperate with questionable matters, but their non-compliance did not lead to their martyrdom. That's the good thing. See, because previously they got killed, they got slaughtered, they got in the middle of a civil war, they decided to take influence and power by force, and they got caught in the middle of the war and they died. This time they avoided the martyrdom. So they found a way to exert broad influence without office or without official power. They found another way to be. Adaptation. That is the genius of the Pharisees during the days of Herod. So we're talking about right on the cusp of the century changing from the BCE to the CE. Okay, we're changing it. That is the sense. That is what they felt. That is the trajectory which they were willing to take. And that's the Pharisees that we essentially meet later on. Questions, thoughts? Yeah.
You could even say that the reason Jews have survived today is because of the Pharisees' adaptation at this point.
That is the attitude. This is a trajectory. This is an attitude. They have done something to give us away, essentially. To be true to who we are, yet live through all the political mess and all the changes of kings and kingdoms, yet we can survive. So that adaptability still endures in today.
That gets insightful to figure it out, but he also used Herod's fear of losing power.
Right.
Uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. He didn't want to lose his crown.
Absolutely. Because in the end, what do Romans want? Romans want taxes. Taxes only come with stability. When there's wars, people stop paying taxes. They wanted to kill you. That doesn't work. Can we just keep you happy enough where you just keep paying taxes and we'll go on? and we'll keep partying in Rome, using your taxes. So they were interested in peace. Herod was interested in peace. He didn't want to antagonize the population. So other procurators, and I told you a history of the procurators, and we got into Festus and Felix last time, and I told you about all those people who stirred up trouble. We talked about how the wars against Rome started. That comes later on. Herod could not keep the lid on that one. Eventually, all of his children could not keep it together, but there was a period of stability, but it came with a price. It came with a cost, and it was a very definitely not an easy time. But it was a reorientation for a lot of people. So, why would they do this? Well, probably because of verses like that. I showed you this before. This is Deuteronomy 28. I just did a little excerpt here for you. It says, "So all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you and overtake you until you are destroyed, because you would not obey the Lord your God by keeping his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded you. Therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, and in the lack of all things. He will put an iron yoke on your neck until he has destroyed you. The Lord will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as an eagle swoops down, a nation whose language you shall not understand. Moreover, you shall eat the offspring of your herd and the produce of your ground until you are destroyed, who also leaves you no grain, no wine, or oil, nor the increase of your herd, or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. And it shall besiege you in all your towns throughout your land, which the Lord your God has given you." Now, this is a warning in Deuteronomy 28. This is a conditional thing. If you don't obey Hashem, curses will come upon you. And then God spells out these curses to Moses. And I guarantee you, Pharisees read this and they said, "Oh no, we're living this. We're living this. How can we get out of this?" Which is why they said, "Can we just have this with no king? We don't need Hyrcanus. We don't need Aristobulus. Can we just get rid of kings and just have God as our king? Can we do that?" When you come into the New Testament era, when you come into the Gospels, that is exactly the sentiment you see. You see this on the lips of Pharisees quite often, but you also see this in the mouth of Yeshua. Those are exactly the kinds of things that he says too.
They conquered many times, but the eagle is Rome.
Right, eagle is
The
Rome.
eagle symbol of Rome.
Yeah,
It's not a shock they saw this.
They see it, they read it, they're like, "Oh my goodness, we're living through this, we're in the thick of this right now." So I'm sure Torah spoke loudly to people at that time, and people understood why they were there. So this is a corrective action that we're seeing. This is what we're noticing. So like Pharisees, Yeshua also famously avoided sharp political debate and all attempts to turn his teaching into political tools. Did you notice that he did that through his teachings? Very deliberate about not turning things political. Why did he do that? Because he didn't want war and carnage and bloodshed. That is not going to end well. He taught to keep the peace. Blessed are the peacemakers, right? Isn't that what he said? Not to resist the authorities. He said if somebody asks you to go 1 mile, go 2 with them. Somebody asks you for one shirt, take off your lower garments too. Like, just take off your coat and your undergarment and give it to them. He says, keep the peace. Don't resist the authorities, and even pay your taxes. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give unto God what's God. God wants your loyalty. He wants your devotion. He wants your heart. You want to give this coin to Caesar? Give it to Caesar. It's nothing. People get all upset about it, but he says, that's nothing. Again, every teaching that Yeshua teaches, and every time people want to twist it and turn it into a political thing, Rabbi, should we pay taxes? Remember? Like they come to him with this question, should we pay taxes? And he answers the question. And he takes that, sort of say, angle of turning this into some sort of a political resistance, and he just calms it all down. And he does that all the time. So remember, he famously proclaimed, any kingdom divided against itself is laid to waste. Any city or house divided against itself will not stand. Now think about these words in light of what we've learned about the Maccabean Wars. Is that not a kingdom divided against itself? Is that not a city? Is that not a people divided against themselves? The reason why Israel was in the position that they were in is because people fought each other endlessly, nonstop. So he said those kinds of things because he wanted for people to have different priorities, an understanding that we can still live lives pleasing to God where we are, how we are. We can still connect to God on that level. We don't have to have a Jewish king on the throne and have an independent kingdom. There's still a possibility to live a deeply spiritual life. So he said those kinds of things. He taught those kinds of things, and Pharisees of his day did the same. In that sense that he falls right into their camp, saying the same kinds of ideas. Now, in light of the Hasmonean kings and those who would hold on to power at any cost, and I mean at any cost, Matthew 6 teaches people to pray for God's kingdom to come. You think about that prayer? Kingdom come. Whose kingdom? God's kingdom. Not of that king or this king. God. God's kingdom. That's what we want. That's what we want to come. Whatever kingdom there is now, the one we really want is God's kingdom. Because that's his will. That would be the best for us. So in Matthew 6:33, we read that the rabbi taught, but seek first his, God's kingdom, and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. If you just orient yourself properly, if most important things are important to you, then all those other things will align themselves eventually. They will work themselves out. Instead of struggling and fighting and getting that power at any cost, the human kingdom failed. So his disciples asked him, just as he was about to depart, when he intended to restore the kingdom of Israel. Remember, when he leaves, they asked him, Rabbi, when are you going to restore all these things? And he says, don't worry, it's not up to you to find out. Don't worry.
That'd be a moment.
Right.
They've been learning from the Persian all these years about not rocking the boat for survival, but underneath, on the other hand, when is it going to happen?
They still want.
Yeah,
So what kingdom do you think they are thinking about? Do you think they're thinking about heavenly kingdom?
No.
Do you think they're thinking about taking over the whole world and putting up synagogues, everybody, getting everybody circumcised? Do you think that's the kingdom they want? Do you think they want Judaism to reign over all the world? No. They just wanted to have the kingdom of Israel restored so that we can have peace, so we can have stability, so the blessings can flow, so we can actually live out our purpose in this world. That's all they wanted. So they turned to him. He's the Messiah. He's the Rabbi. When are you going to restore it? Would now be the time you do it? Basically, that's what they're asking. We've been waiting for this for a long time. Next Tuesday. And so, of course, he doesn't give them the answer that they want. But what I want you to see through all this is the trajectory of Yeshua's teachings is really a response to many of the events of history that I just described to you. He is teaching and preaching a different way of living life, a different priority, a different orientation by saying things like making the kingdom, seeking God's kingdom and his righteousness first and foremost, and then other things will align themselves. That is what he's doing. He's providing people a direction. And so it fits very well with the broader teaching of people who were really in touch with spiritual sense of what it means to be a Jew who wants to follow the Torah. And so he falls into that same category, and that's why he taught his disciples he taught. So in the end, this is still the conflict of darkness and light within us today. As I said, it hasn't stopped. What we're seeing there and what we're seeing here happening in our lives today, still the same battle we're fighting, because the battle is on the inside. It is on the outside, but it is just as much on the inside. Shaul wrote about Yetzer Hara, fighting the things, the things that I want to do, I don't do. The things that I don't want to do, I do. And what is this? And the victory that we want is to be free from being dependent of falling into the same trap over and over again the freedom of being able to walk through, persevere, live through it, and live victoriously and say, no, I'm not going to fall into this trap again and again and again. I'm going to say no to darkness, and I'm going to walk away. I'm not hopeless in this situation. And that's where Mashiach comes in. That's where the merit of Messiah comes in. He gives us the power, the ability to forge a new and a different direction, a realization that there is a better way. His teachings, that's what they lead us to. If we but open our hearts and listen to them and actually take them in and not twist them into some dominion theology or something like that. You know, you heard about those. So I'm not going to even go down that route because it's going to spoil the mood. Yes, Ralph.
I have two observations, one from the Tanakh, the other from Brit Hadashah, about the Hasmoneans dynasty and them being both kings and priests. And through your teaching, I keep getting this recurring thought about King Shaul disobeying Samuel. He was impatient. He was waiting for Samuel to come. Samuel didn't come when he wanted him to come, so he intervenes and he makes the sacrifice.
Right.
So
He starts acting like a priest.
So he, in other words, my conclusion was that he wanted to be both king and priest.
Essentially.
Okay,
At that moment, that's what he did.
Yeah.
He crossed the line. He usurped that power.
And my other observation from the New Testament is about the priesthood, and when John the Immerser came onto the scene, he totally was in rejection of what was happening at the temple with the priesthood, and he's out in the wilderness.
Right.
Eating locusts and honey and wearing camels
Preparing people for the kingdom.
for the kingdom, for the king. So, even with that, it shows that there is a
Right.
stark contrast, a stark difference from what was happening from a systematic standpoint to a new era that was being initiated.
Yes, yes. And remember why he got killed, right? How he lost his head.
Because
He criticized the authority.
Right, yes, he got political.
So he got political just for a second. Well, he didn't get political. He just said what Torah says, you can't do this.
Did not have your
You
public
cannot
life,
do
right.
that. And boom, off with your head. That's just a little inch into politics, and that was the end of it. Yes, very good observation, Rob. I think that's a good observation. Anybody else thoughts, ideas as you reflect on this? I know I'm going to make you now reread the New Testament in a different light, right? Again, history is powerful. Yes.
Just a reminder of what you're saying, that a lot of the idea of salvation in the Gospels is about a very literal kingdom,
Right.
not necessarily the way
Yes.
it's looked at today.
Yeah, people have spiritualized a lot of these ideas. So when we talk about kingdom, right? So you realize that the idea of the kingdom has been spiritualized. When the Gospels talk about kingdom, they're talking about a very literal kingdom. They're talking about actually living without a human king and allowing God to be king. Like back to the days of, Samuel, before Saul, right? That's what we're talking about. Like, can we return to that? It's not talking about some sort of political dominion or anything like that. But people take the idea of the kingdom and they attach their idea of what kingdom is, right? Perhaps very Western, more modern ideas of kingdom. And then that's how they interpret the gospel. Or they take the idea of heavenly kingdom, like meaning the other side, meaning like afterlife. That becomes another euphemism for the kingdom of God. But I'm sorry, the kingdom of God is here and now, not when I die. I mean, I want to live with God now. I don't have to be dead to start doing that. So the same, what happens with the concept of kingdom happens with salvation. This is what James is talking about. that concept of salvation that people saw in a very tangible, very real way gets transferred into some sort of a heavenly experience or some spiritual experience of salvation. They are thinking in a very concrete way. When the disciple says, when is the kingdom going to be restored? They're very specific. And the same thing about salvation, that's kind of how they think that way. Yes, ma'am?
Well, yeah, when they speak of the kingdom, they're very much speaking of Israel and getting rid of the Romans and having the
Right.
country back and doing all this. But there are other places too where they're speaking about the eternal kingdom. Do not
There
believe
are.
I am who I say I am, you will die in your sins. And he
Right.
was talking to Jewish people. There was
We have
someone
some
else
clues.
there.
We have some clues when those moments happen, right?
Eternal people.
Yes.
So it's life and then life eternal.
Absolutely. So one of the places where that comes on very clearly and very strongly all the way through is the Gospel of John,
Yeah.
right?
Very strong.
Very strong and very powerful, because it's just conducive to the kind of language in which it was written,
Yeah.
which is why it's written in a much more proverbial language and much less narrative-like language. It talks a lot about these big ideas, big concepts. There's a lot of symbolism in the Gospel of John, and so it's much more conducive because it makes you think in a broader sense, and that's how it's designed to be. It's designed to heal our soul, essentially. That's what it's trying to get us to connect on a different level. So you're absolutely right. So it's just my line is always the same to you. In light of what you learn, rethink what you know. Okay, reread. I'm telling you these stories and I'm telling you this history because I want to create a background. You know me, I'm all about background, I'm all about context. I have a very famous saying that I say all the time, is that words matter, but the context changes everything. When you know what the context is, all of a sudden those words, they're understood in a very, very different light. And that's what we do a lot of times is we study context, and that's what this study's been about. So guess what? Next, we're going to jump into Pharisees. Further in, I'm going to talk about the different kinds of Pharisees, Hillel, Shammai, the divisions, the groups, how did they come to be? I'll give you a little bit of a religious history of Pharisees according to Pharisees, and then I'll give you some of perspectives that maybe not according to Pharisees per se, because remember, we don't really have a lot of data and information from that era, so we just do the best we can with what we've got. But I'll share with you about some of their beliefs and ideals and how they play into that world of the first century. Okay, so that's what's next. All right.